Although there is evidence of human habitation in parts of the UK prior to the Neolithic period, it's not until the Neolithic period that we have some indication of what we might interpret as religious beliefs. The construction of the earliest earthwork sites in Britain began during the early Neolithic, circa 4400 to 3300 BCE, in the form of long barrows used for communal burial and the first causewayed enclosures. Henges were built during the latter Neolithic period, circa 2900 to 2200 BCE, along with stone rows and the famous sites of Stonehenge, Avebury and Silbury Hill. One of the most famous forms of Neolithic art and architecture were the megalithic stone circles of Western Europe, of which the best known is Stonehenge. Indeed, stone circles are particularly associated with the British Isles, with some 1,303 circles. I wrote this technically complex construction, but is it? Well, fairly complex construction. May attest to their supernatural power, to the people who built them. We really don't know. The Prehistoric Hills, where some of the stones for Stonehenge were sourced, might have held deep significance to the megalith's builders. It's certainly a long way away. Though the exact role of the stone circle is unclear, they seem to have, in part or all, been mausoleums. They contain many skeletons, particularly skulls. They seem to track to ancestor worship, and in particular veneration of deceased members of elite spiritual social classes. Stone circles also appear to be linked to cycles of the sun and the moon. Stonehenge, for instance, is aligned such that on the solstices the sun rises and sets directly behind it. But could it be that over time Stonehenge was used by different religions, for different religious purposes? At the early Bronze Age, circa 2200 to 750 BCE, Britons buried their dead beneath earth mounds known as barrows, often with a beaker alongside their body, and hence they're known as the beaker people. Later in the period, cremation was adopted as burial practice, with cemeteries of urns containing the cremated individuals appearing in the archaeological record, sometimes with metal objects such as daggers. It's disputed that during the Iron Age, around 750 BCE to 43 CE, most people inhabiting the British Isles were Celts. Indeed, the very notion of Celt is now a subject of academic debate. Place names and tribal names from the latter part of the period suggest that a Celtic Brythonic language was spoken. Certainly during the last centuries before the Roman invasion, saw an influx of Celtic-speaking Gauls, approximately modern-day France and Belgium, known as the Belgi. But they were displaced as soon as the Roman Empire expanded around 50 BCE. They settled along most of the coastline of southern Britain between 200 BCE and 43 CE, although it's hard to estimate what proportion of the population they were in these areas. A prehistoric religion, like later hunter-gatherer religion, possibly drew from shamanism and ecstatic experience as well as animism, though analysis indicates that animism may have emerged much earlier. The evidence left in the archaeological record is very strongly suggestive of a visionary framework where faith is practiced through entering trances, personal experience with deities, and the other hallmarks of shamanism. Shamanism may have been a major part of the Upper Paleolithic religion. This refers to the spiritual practices involving altered states of consciousness, where practitioners render themselves in ecstatic or extreme psychological states in order to commune with spirits or deities. But the study of prehistoric shamanism is controversial, to say the least. The shamanistic interpretation of prehistoric religion is based on the neuropsychological model, where shamanic experience is deemed an inherent function of the human brain. The symbols associated with shamanic art, such as animal-human hybrid figures, are suggested to originate from certain levels of trance. Of course, the neuropsychological model has been criticised. Critics refer to the relative rarity of some forms of the art associated with it, to tendencies in modern shamanistic cultures they find incompatible with it, and to the scepticism of archaeologists. This debate is somewhat played out right now between Graham Hancock and the architectural establishment. Now, I've just said that Graham Hancock is having a fight with the architectural establishment, and of course I mean the archaeological establishment, although God bless you, Graham, I bet you could take on the architectural establishment as well. Celtic religion is believed to have been polytheistic, with many deities, both gods and goddesses, some of which were venerated only in a small area or region or by a particular tribe, but others whose worship had a wider geographic distribution. The names of over 200 Celtic deities have survived, although it's likely that many of these were alternative names, regional names, or titles maybe for the same deity. According to a number of Greco-Roman writers such as Julius Caesar, Cicero, Tacitus and Pliny the Elder, British society had a group of magico-religious leaders known as the Druids, who were held in high esteem. Their roles and responsibilities differed somewhat between different accounts, but Caesar's, which is the fullest and earliest original text to describe the Druids, described them as being concerned with divine worship and due performance of sacrifices, public or private, and the interpretation of ritual questions. But as the Romans killed off the Druids, there is almost nothing to tell us about their actual beliefs and practices. Vernacular Welsh and Irish sources do refer to the Druids, portraying them not only as priests but as sorcerers who had supernatural powers that were used for cursing and divination, and who opposed the coming of Christianity. It's often difficult to know which Celtic gods predate the Romans and which were imported from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, as beliefs mingled and borrowed from one another. Indeed, whilst there may be some doubt if the Britons were actually Celtic, it would seem that when Celtic gods were imported from Gaul, they were taken to rather quickly by the native Britons. Whereas Roman deities such as Jupiter and Minerva were worshipped in forts and temples, while architectural evidence shows that figures worshipped by Britons also continues. Other communities in northern Britain and Ireland remained untouched by any Roman influence, and so therefore Celtic religious practices continued somewhat unaffected. Roman Britain, 43 CE to 410 CE, provides the main evidence we have of paganism, which lasted some 400 years and covered much of England, Wales and lowland Scotland. The core, however, was limited to southern and eastern England from the Exe to the Tees, although there is evidence of contact with Rome from the 4th century BCE. to the degree that southern England was fairly Romanised prior to the invasion. Furthermore, following the end of Roman rule, an area below the Clyde was heavily Romanised until around 600 to 700 CE, especially in the former outlying areas in South Wales, Devon and Cornwall. Although, of course, by this later period, the Romano-Britons were Christian, following the conversion of Constantine in 312 CE. Nevertheless, it can be seen that Roman influence in Britain lasted some 800 to 900 years. The Romans didn't seek to conquer or convert others to their religion, only economic dominance. Instead, they favoured syncretism, a merging of the beliefs that they saw existing gods mingle with Roman deities, with temples sitting alongside spiritual sites in a multi-faith society. Therefore, people in Roman Britain typically believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses and worshipped several of them, likely selecting some local and tribal deities as well as some of the major divinities venerated across the empire. Both indigenous British deities and introduced Roman counterparts were venerated in the region, sometimes syncretising together, as in cases like Apollo Conomalgus and Celis Minerva. Romano-British temples were sometimes erected at locations that had early been cultic sites in the pre-Roman Iron Age. A new style of Romano-Celtic temple developed, which is influenced by both Iron Age and Imperial Roman architectural styles, but unique from both. Buildings in this style remained in use until the 4th century. The cults of various Eastern deities have been introduced to Roman Britain, among them the deities of Isis and Mithras. Christianity was but one of these Eastern cults. Roman Britain was not only multicultural but multi-faith, reflecting a huge degree of tolerance by the Romans. There's no doubt that some Britons adopted Roman religion, and many more would have adopted local versions of Roman deity. But there's no way of knowing if these local deities were actually the equivalent of those of Roman beliefs. For example, the local nymph of the River Severn was Havre, which was translated to Sabrina. But was the nymph actually the same as a Roman god, or simply a spirit of the water? Despite the Romans themselves having a huge pantheon of deities, it's possibly erroneous to see them as gods. They were deities who you petitioned for a particular issue, hence the huge pantheon. Temples in the main were homes for the deities, rather than places of communal worship, rather like the spirit houses I've talked about in Bangkok. Religion was a very personal thing, more like what we now call superstition than a formal religion. A ritual was used, but these were often private rituals for petitioning the gods. In the main, philosophy was separate from religion. It followed on from the Hellenistic traditions, including Neoplatonism. Therefore, maybe our focus on the Roman pantheon of gods is the wrong focus if we engage in a study of comparative religion. Indeed, as Neoplatonism has a concept of the one, it can be argued that at least some Romans were in fact monotheists. And maybe this tells us more about the religion of the ancients than their interpretation by the conquering Romans. If religion was a very personal thing and much less formalised than today, then are we focusing on completely the wrong aspects of the belief system of what we know about the ancients? Anglo-Saxon or early medieval England existed from the 5th to the 11th centuries, from the end of Roman Britain until the Norman conquest in 1066. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the 5th and 6th centuries are conveniently identified as 7 main kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex and Wessex. So like the core of Roman Britain, it was concentrated in the south and east of England, and they were Christianised during the 7th century. In 927 CE, it was united as the Kingdom of England by King Athelstan, who reigned from 927 to 939, and it became part of the short-lived North Sea Empire of Canute the Great, a personal union between England, Denmark and Norway in the 11th century. Anglo-Saxon paganism refers to beliefs and practices followed by the Anglo-Saxons between the 5th and 8th centuries CE, during the initial period of early medieval England. However, Christianity was coexisting with these beliefs in many parts of Britain, and from the 7th century Anglo-Saxons began converting. It appears to be a variant of Germanic paganism found across much of northwestern Europe. It encompassed a heterogeneous variety of beliefs and cultic practices, although with many regional variations. Anglo-Saxon paganism was a polytheistic belief system, focused around a belief in deities known as the Esse, or singular Os. The most prominent of these deities was probably Woden. Other prominent gods included Thunor and Twi. There's also a belief in a variety of other supernatural entities which inhabited the landscape, including elves, Nikor and dragon. Cultic practices largely around a demonstration of devotion, including sacrifice of inanimate objects and animals to these deities, particularly at certain religious festivals during the year. There's some evidence of the existence of timber temples, although other cultic spaces may have been open air, and would have included cultic trees and megaliths. Many Anglo-Saxonists have assumed that Anglo-Saxon paganism was animistic in basis, believing in a landscape populated by different spirits and other non-human forms, such as elves, dwarves and dragons. Little is known about the pagan conceptions of the afterlife, although such beliefs likely influenced funerary practices, in which the dead were either inhumed or cremated, typically with a selection of grave goods. The belief system also included ideas about magic and witchcraft and elements that could be classified as a form of shamanism. There's no evidence that anyone living in Anglo-Saxon England ever described themselves as pagan or understood there to be a singular religion, paganism, that stood as a monolithic alternative to Christianity. These pagan belief systems would have been inseparable from other aspects of daily life. But as the pre-Christian society of Anglo-Saxon was illiterate, there is no contemporary written evidence produced by the Anglo-Saxon pagans themselves. Alas, no cultic buildings have survived from the Anglo-Saxon period, and nor do they have contemporary illustrations or even clear descriptions of a structure. Professor Ronald Hutton doubts that Anglo-Saxon paganism had a major influence on Britain, but is quick to point out that we have so little evidence about what they really believed. How could we trace its influence? Between the 8th and 11th centuries, raiders and colonists from Scandinavia, mainly Danish and Norwegian, plundered Western Europe, including the British Isles. These raiders came to be known as the Vikings. The name is believed to derive from Scandinavia, where they originated. The first raids in the British Isles were in the late 8th century, mainly on isolated churches and monasteries, which were seen as centres of wealth and poorly defended. The raiding then virtually stopped for around 40 years, but in around 1835 it started becoming more regular. In the 1860s, instead of raids, the Danes mounted a full-scale invasion. In 1965, an enlarged army arrived that the Anglo-Saxons described as the Great Heathen Army. This was reinforced in 871 by the Great Summer Army. Within 10 years, nearly all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell to the invaders. Northumbria in 867, East Anglia in 869, and nearly all of Mercia in 874 and 877. The Old Norse religion was polytheistic, entailing a belief in various gods and goddesses. These deities in Norse mythology were divided into groups: the Aesir and the Vanir, who in some sources were said to have engaged in an ancient war until they realised that they were equally powerful. Amongst the most widespread of the deities were Odin and Thor. This world was also inhabited by the various of the mythological races, including the Jontar, dwarves, elves, and the left whites. Norse cosmology revolved around the world tree known as Yggdrasil, with various realms existing alongside that of humans, named Midgard. These included multiple afterlife realms, several of which are controlled by a particular deity. The English Church found that it needed to conduct a new conversion process to Christianise the incoming Scandinavian population. It appears that the Scandinavian migrants had converted to Christianity within a few decades of their arrival. As ever, Professor Ronald Hutton casts some doubt on what we actually know about the Viking religion, as the main source are the Viking chronicles, originating in the then Christianised Iceland. Certainly he shows that at the very least traditional religions were influenced by Christianity within Danelaw before the Vikings themselves becoming Christian. As ever, Professor Ronald Hutton argues, especially in relation to the religions of prehistory, there are two traditions with which we attempt to understand them. Firstly, that man is by nature good and that the ancients were more in touch with nature, even with the essence of humanity. A tradition which I have to admit is much closer to my own beliefs. And secondly, that man is by nature bad, even evil, and that the ancients were particularly brutal, including their religious practices. An interesting observation is that some modern pagans incorporate this view in their beliefs, using notions such as Carl Jung's shadow self to justify pagans' supposed brutality. What should be apparent is that apart from Roman Britain, little evidence has been left on the actual religious practices of the people living in Britain. All too often, the interpretation is by people with a very different religion, and indeed the victors over these ancient people. A common pattern seems to suggest that the ancient religions were polytheistic, involved sacrifice, including human sacrifice, and in general were much less sophisticated than modern man. But as I have argued, are such accusations of polytheism as simply a misinterpretation of the ancient religious beliefs? Could we interpret the gods as gods actually refer to spirits of natural features? This would point to a much more animistic appreciation of the universe. Maybe that the spirits are simply a mechanism for understanding the consciousness of nature. In truth, we have no idea. But there's at least as much evidence for this to argue as the ancients were polytheists. Sacrifice is, of course, a central part of many belief systems. Often this involves food offerings and often a ritual feasting with this food. After all, what else is the sacrament within Christianity? Just as today in Islam some animal sacrifice does form a part of ancient religions. But why would it be any different to modern practices within Christianity and Islam? To the extent that to extend this to human sacrifice based on a Roman smear campaign against the Druids makes no sense. How do we know that the seemingly sacrificed bodies that have been recovered are not indicative of capital punishment, of the rule of law rather than the lack of it? Indeed, some of the most important evidence of human sacrifice, such as Lindo Man, is disputed, and it would seem to be more likely to be from the Roman period than actually from prehistory. What I'm suggesting is that our beliefs about religion, the religions of the ancients, are at best informed by a cultural imperialism. At worst, they're downright racist. For example, recent DNA analysis suggests far greater continuity amongst the ancient Britons than our historic tradition of conquests suggests. At its most pernicious, critiques from the Abrahamic religions accuse the ancients of Satanism. But Satan is a concept from the Abrahamic religions, in particular Protestant Christianity. So it's totally ludicrous to claim that pre-Abrahamic people worshipped a concept from an Abrahamic religion, but then claiming that anything we don't understand to be satanic has a long tradition within the Abrahamic religions. For those who lived before us are much less sophisticated is a supreme arrogance, and my main criticism of the Enlightenment. But that is the prerogative of victors at times of